Hello there, my name's Card. Here on my YouTube page, I've made a fair few videos about a broad topic of particular interest to me: how social beliefs play out in people's real-world, day-to-day lives. Usually, whether I'm delivering more objective facts or my own opinions, I try to speak plainly and directly about whatever it is I want to discuss. But this video will be a bit different. Today I want to broach a topic that I haven't mentioned on here before, and it's one that I personally, honestly, have not yet been able to find my final opinion on, despite having given it plenty of thought in the past, and looked into plenty of the discourse surrounding it. Namely, the concept of identifying with a race that most observers would not consider your own. For the lack of any better terminology in this area, I'll be referring to this from here on out in this video as transracialism and being transracial. Like most people, my first instinct is to immediately say that that's just not a thing, and that anyone claiming it is, especially if they themselves claim to be transracial, is most likely just lying to themselves and/or you. But I do want to explore all the best arguments suggesting otherwise. Consider this video me essentially playing devil's advocate with myself out loud, so it most likely won't be as long or as structured as my videos normally are, but I do think it'll be worth making all the same, if only for my own sake. And I'll just reassert here that I don't think I have an opinion one way or the other just yet myself. And I really would like to hear from people who might end up listening to this who do feel strongly about one or the other side of this debate. So feel free to use the comment section productively after listening to this one. But enough preamble, I'll get into it. So the way I see it, what we're talking about here is whether or not it would theoretically be valid that someone express a desire to be perceived as, and self-identify as, another race. I don't want to get into the weeds with things like how the idea of race and how we attach discrete identities to skin tone is itself a social construct, because we all know what I mean here. The most well-known example of what I'm talking about is, of course, Rachel Dolezal. Just in case you don't know the story, Rachel Dolezal was a college educator and vocal NAACP activist who, her whole career, claimed to be, and convincingly presented, as a mixed-race black woman. Then, in 2015, comes to international attention when a happenstance look into her background by a local media org turns up the fact that she's completely, ethnically just a regular white American. Both of her biological parents are white, all her siblings are white. She was raised in the same basic Western European American culture that any other white middle-class Gen X American was. But even after what we might call her fraud was revealed, she continued to identify as a black person. Dolezal isn't the only person who's ever made this sort of claim, but it is exceedingly rare. And it just so happened that this particular example got significantly more attention, shall we say, than the few other times it's ever made the news. And it also just happened to come to light around about the time that transgender issues were also starting to come to mainstream attention and getting thought about by a lot of people for the very first time. I do think it's worthwhile bringing up that comparison to the transgender movement too. And I would like to reiterate here what I do believe in regards to the validity of transgenderism, and have even argued for on this very YouTube page before. That I do believe in the validity of both binary and non-binary trans identities, and I also reject trans medicalist gatekeeping in favor of broad, good faith self-ID on the matter. Therefore, denying the possibility of this hypothetical trans-racial identity just on strict basic biological essentialist lines doesn't sit right with me. If we use the argument that allowing people to change their gender presentation, physically, socially, and legally, is necessary because of gender dysphoria being a real diagnosable condition that can be remedied through transition as a medical process, and then use that as the basis for why you should be able to change gender, but seemingly not race, then I can't believe that either. Again, in line with my thoughts about self-ID, I don't believe that the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, or even the occurrence of gender dysphoria of any kind, is essential to the validity of someone's transgender identity. And second of all, hard as these sorts of things can be to define or quantify, I do think that hypothetically, racial dysphoria could exist, both physically and socially. It's an oft-reported experience of many lighter-skinned people of mixed African descent in the US that they're often ostracized to some extent by their darker-skinned peers for, quote, being less black. And the obverse is also true, where darker persons of color report social discrimination on occasion from the lighter members of their community. That's called colorism, and long story short, it's also a byproduct of humanity's long history of explicit racial bigotry. But it's not like it would be impossible for someone to internalize these sorts of prejudices, where they might start to irrationally dislike the very color of their skin, or people's perception of it. If we hold transitioning race to the same standard as transitioning gender, then I don't think having any sort of dysphoria would even be necessary. But if you do want to make the case that it would be, then I'd still assert that racial dysphoria can exist. And in a case like Dolezal's, if someone wants to alter the color of their skin, or the texture of their hair, or some other signifier of ethnicity to assuage their appearance-related anxiety, then I don't see any real harm in that. And I don't think that anyone is going to undergo those sorts of procedures, even if they were more normalized, say, in some far-flung future, if they didn't feel a deeply held need to do so. There's a turf anti-transgender talking point that essentially argues that trans women are actually predatory men trying to infiltrate femininity, and that's nonsense. Trans people aren't trying to take over cis people's spaces. In much the same way, I just can't see why anyone would try to infiltrate a cultural identity for no reason. I don't have a horse in this race either way, since for one, I'm perfectly happy with being the race I already get perceived as by anyone who looks at me. And on the whole, I'd rather err on the side of progressive caution and try my best not to gatekeep labels. And generally, I don't think purity testing is the way to go, especially not with something as immensely varied and inherently personal as someone's identity. Our modern conception of race may be essentially as made up as our 20th century holdover conception of binary gender identities, but that doesn't mean we still don't use racial categories as easy descriptive shorthand, or that one's ethnic and cultural background doesn't have some effect on your conception of self. Obviously, anyone who has two parents of fully African ancestry would be black, and most people would agree that someone with, say, one black parent and one white, who themselves identifies as black, is black. The most visible example of that would be someone like America's first black president, Barack Obama. And in fact, the overwhelming majority of black people in the US have at least some prominent non-black ancestry. But I don't think it's all that productive to try and find where the exact line you can claim a POC identity is. Is someone with just one black grandparent black? What about one great-grandparent? Does the answer change in either case depending on the exact shade their skin appears to be? It's like arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. An interesting conversation for a while, sure, but it doesn't actually serve a purpose. In that Rachel Dolezal case, the fact that she got away with claiming a black identity based solely on her appearance for so long proves that she passed as black to anyone who saw her, and therefore would have been being affected by all the same interpersonal microaggression prejudices that conservatives seem too scared to acknowledge exist too. In an ideal world, no one would feel any internalized prejudice or negativity about their appearance. But until that's the case in reality, we might as well let people look how they want, as far as I can see it. When it comes to someone like Dolezal, no matter what you think of her darkening her complexion, it's not like you could ever make it illegal to tan heavily or curl your hair. And supposing someone with naturally darker skin wanted to lighten it or straighten out their hair more, or even do something like put in blue or green contact lenses and do a black to white transracial identity, I think that's perfectly fine by me too. Legally even, the government doesn't mandate racial identity markers or anything on your IDs like that either. And if you get a census or something asking you your ethnicity, you realize that there's nothing stopping you from ticking whichever box you want. If this ever becomes a big topic of debate within the cultural discourse again, I think the question isn't going to be framed as, is transracialism valid, as much as it will be, should transracialism be valid? And if that's the case, I think it would be up to people championing each side of the argument at the time to decide for themselves how they want to frame the question of cultural identity in the public eye. And things could go anywhere from there. People who, like myself, argue for the validity of non-binary gender identities point out correctly that specifically non-man, non-woman, third gender roles have existed across all sorts of societies for millennia. But being non-binary, in the modern Western sense, with the they-them pronouns and the purple, yellow, black and white flag and all that, might as well have been invented in 2014. That doesn't invalidate it, of course, I would maintain, but it goes to show that a concept that would have gotten you laughed out of the room among even the most progressive company in the world, not even 20 years ago, has not only gone all but mainstream within the generation that's coming of age currently, it's now even the position of a majority of self-described leftists to affirm the existence of non-binary persons. My favorite political news item in recent years was when, during the last US presidential campaign, Joe Biden, who is himself an 80-year-old lifelong Catholic, said there were, quote, at least three genders at the Iowa State Fair. Just think about how far we've managed to come that quickly. Although, for what it's worth, I would hope that we'd still recognize and protect transgender identities, even if they were only being claimed by a literal handful of people on Earth, as transracial identities are only being claimed seriously today by a very small number. I have no reason to think it necessarily would, but I have no reason to see why transracialism couldn't just be a normal thing by, say, the year 2050. If enough people ever believe in it, then it will be up for public discussion in earnest. And once that happens, who knows if it'll take off. Although, with a general increase in non-white persons as a percentage of Western countries' populations projected within the next few generations, I could easily imagine that the subsequent increase in mixed ethnicity children, we can reasonably assume will also result, could throw questions about what race in practice means up in the air in our lifetimes. For what it's worth, I don't consciously treat people any different based on their race. So if someone wants an identity conspicuously different from their skin tone, I don't think it'll really matter to me. In real-world terms, I also don't ever see anyone in real life claiming to be transracial, and frankly, neither do you. I can't say that I've worked out a perfect position for myself on the matter, but I don't think it's important that I need one. It's just simply not a discussion we're having yet. But if someday that discussion does come, I'm not going to be the one leading the fight to make transracialism a widely accepted thing. Nor am I going to work myself into a frenzy denouncing it. Thanks for listening to my little rambling back and forth on the matter. Like I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, and I will reiterate now, I would like to read what other people have to say if they do have something to add, so please do feel free to comment down below. Until next time, my name's Card. This has been Card Posting. Bye for now, and have a lovely day.